So today is the fifth and final Sunday of our message series, Attitude Adjustment. The attitude that we're talking about adjusting is the virtue of humility. We learned that humility is grounded in the reality that everything we have ultimately comes from God. It turns out that we grow in humility as we listen. Humble people are listeners, and they listen first and foremost to God. We looked one week at how we're tempted to compare ourselves with others, especially to compare ourselves to other people's faults and failures to feel better about ourselves. And that, we found out, kills humility. You can catch all of these online if you missed a week. But for this week, we hope to bring it home by covering how helpful the attitude of humility can be when it comes to recognizing and eliminating sin in our life. To do it, we're going to take a look at the passage that we just heard from the Gospel of John. And in it, we hear that Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. But early in the morning, he arrived again in the temple area, and the people started coming to him, and he sat down and he taught them. So at a certain period towards the end of Jesus' life, he spent some time in Jerusalem teaching at the temple every day. But in the evening, he would retire to the countryside to the Mount of Olives. So here he's coming back in the morning to teach at the temple. That's when they brought a woman who had been caught in adultery and made her stand in the middle of the crowd. They said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded to stone such women. So what do you say?" They said this to test him so that they could have some charge to bring against him. So Jesus is teaching in front of the temple before this huge crowd. The religious leaders, the Pharisees and the scribes, whom we've met before, they show up and interrupt him and introduce this very strange scene. Apparently, they've caught a woman in the very act of committing adultery. One can often wonder, how did they do that? Anyway, they create this huge scene simply to trip up Jesus and to trap him as someone who breaks the law, which was a very serious offense in his time. They were deliberately casting him in an unwinnable position because the Jewish law called for death by stoning, but the Roman law forbade such things. So whichever way he responded, he'd be breaking someone's law. This points to the stark contrast between Jesus's consistent teaching of mercy and forgiveness juxtaposed against these harsh and inhumane laws. So in the face of this test and the seemingly impossible challenge at hand, here's what he did. That he bent down and began to write on the ground with his finger. So he just slows things down. I don't know about you, but when I get in situations when I'm stressed out, or someone's attacking me or trying to trip me up, my emotions can sometimes command my response, and I'm tempted to respond in an impulsive way. And when we respond in an impulsive way, it rarely serves us any good. That's not what Jesus does here, though. He just slows things down. One of the most effective things that you can do when confronted with unexpected conflict or sudden emergency or surprise is to just pause, because there's power in the pause. So he takes his time to answer. And when he finally does, he says, "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to cast a stone." One of the all-time brilliant responses. He totally reframes the issue so that it's not about the accusation, it's about the accusers and their sinfulness. And then he goes back to writing in the sand. Through the centuries, people have often pondered, what was he writing? It's the only time in the scriptures that it records Jesus ever writing anything. And the Gospel of John doesn't even tell us what he's writing. Some suggest that the woman wasn't even guilty, and Jesus is writing out the charge against her in sand to underscore its false quality. Some people think he was writing the names of the leaders themselves, as well as their sins, as a way of shaming them. Some people think that he was writing out the law itself, which demanded that both the woman and the man be punished. These religious leaders had only brought the woman, so he's calling attention to the fact that they're actually also in violation of the law. But really, we don't know. All we know is that in response, they went away one by one. So Jesus was left alone with the woman before him. And Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir." Then Jesus said, "Then neither do I condemn you." He humbles the religious leaders who had exalted themselves with so much pride that they couldn't even recognize the Messiah they were waiting for when they saw him. He humbles the mighty, and in the process, he exalts the humble, lifting this woman out of her shame and giving her a way forward. And he tells her, though, "Go and sin no more." I think the emphasis here is on the word go. Go. He gives her life back, but he gives her more than that. He gives her a way forward into her future, a future that now can be lived free from sin and shame. Humility is her path out. As we know, not all sin is of the same weight. For instance, in this story, the woman's sin is actually less weighty than the sins of the religious leaders. It's true, she committed adultery, and that's pretty serious. But their sin is one of pride, and that's more serious. That's worse. In fact, it's the most serious sin of all. It was the sin of Lucifer and the fallen angels. And that's the sin of the Pharisees too. That's why over and over again, Jesus reserves his most bruising and his most withering criticism to be directed towards them. The reason pride is the most serious sin is because it blinds us to other sin in our life, thereby can be the most consequential of sins. You know, whatever stage or station of life you're in, your life and mine, for sure, is something marked and marred by sin. And if you're like most people in our community, perhaps that sin is not terribly serious in the larger scheme of things, perhaps not always deeply consequential. Things like gossip or ingratitude or impatience or overindulgence, purity and temperance, they're all sin for sure. But you know that sometimes God actually allows us to struggle with sin. Perhaps it's to teach us humility. Sometimes God saves us from the worst possible sin, the sin of pride. We need to acknowledge our sin humbly before God, but also to others when appropriate. That can be the path out of sin. Because while pride blinds us to sin and inevitably leads to more sin, humility can recognize it and helps to move beyond it with Christ's help. Humility, it's not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less.